in the heart of a dusty frontier town where the sun burned hot and the wind carried whispers of both lawlessness and honor. A crowd had gathered on Main Street, their faces tight with unease. The day had started like any other, merchants opening their shops, children playing by the water trough, and the clinking sound of spurs on wooden boardwalks. But by midday, tension snapped like a taut rope. In the center of the street, a woman stumbled backward, her cheek reddened by the sharp sting of her husband's hand. The crack of the slap rang louder than the church bells ever could, silencing the laughter of townsfolk and freezing everyone in place. She was a small woman, fragile in build but strong in spirit, her eyes glistening with humiliation more than pain. Her husband, a bitter man with whiskey on his breath and rage in his veins, towered over her, his voice booming with threats. "You'll learn your place," he growled, raising his hand again. People watched, but no one moved. Fear of crossing the wrong man kept their boots nailed to the ground. But then out of the crowd, a figure stepped forward, a tall cowboy with broad shoulders, weathered skin and eyes that could cut through steel. His hat shaded his face, but his jaw was set with the kind of resolve only a man who had fought battles, both inside and out, could wear. The town knew him, though he spoke little. He wasn't born here, but his reputation for fairness, courage, and unshakable strength had followed him like dust follows a rider on a long trail. His voice carried steady and low, but it sliced through the air like a blade when he spoke. "Not while I'm breathing." The husband froze, his hand still raised, his chest heaving like a bull ready to charge. "This is none of your business, cowboy," he spat, trying to puff his chest bigger than his shame. "She's my wife. I'll deal with her as I see fit." The cowboy didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. He stepped between the man and the trembling woman, positioning himself like a wall of stone. "No man," the cowboy said, his voice like rolling thunder, "has the right to raise his hand against a woman. Not here, not anywhere." The townsfolk leaned in, their curiosity and anticipation rising, for they had never seen anyone stand toe-to-toe with the drunken brute who had long ruled his home with fear and fists. The woman clutched her shawl tighter, her lip trembling, but in her eyes flickered a spark of hope, a fragile light, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to finally tell her she wasn't meant to live under the weight of violence. Her husband sneered, pulling back his shoulders. "You think you can tell me how to live my life, cowboy? You think you can take what's mine?" His words dripped with venom, but the cowboy stood calm, his hands steady at his sides, though everyone knew how quick they could fly to the revolvers at his hips. "She ain't yours," the cowboy replied, his eyes narrowing. "She's her own person. And if you think you'll lay another hand on her while I'm standing here, you've got another think coming." The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The husband, puffed up by liquor and pride, swung his fist at the cowboy, expecting to see him fall like any other man he'd bullied. But the cowboy was quicker than the strike, catching the man's arm mid-air with the strength of a steel trap. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The cowboy twisted the arm just enough to send pain shooting up the man's shoulder, but not enough to break it yet. "That's enough," the cowboy said through gritted teeth. The husband yanked free, his face red with fury, and lunged again, but this time the cowboy's fist met his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt street. Dust rose around him like smoke from a gun barrel. The crowd cheered, not loud, not wild, but a low rumble of relief, like justice had finally been given a voice. The woman's breath hitched, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She had lived too long under silence, too long with the belief that no one would ever step in, and now, here was a stranger, a cowboy who had risked everything to defend her dignity. The husband groaned, trying to rise, but the cowboy placed the heel of his boot against the man's chest and pressed him back, down into the dirt. "You're done," the cowboy growled. "You lift your hand again. You'll answer to me, and I don't make threats I don't keep." The sheriff, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, finally stepped forward, perhaps ashamed that he hadn't acted sooner. "That's enough now," the sheriff said, though his tone lacked conviction. The cowboy glanced at him, then at the crowd, then back at the woman who stood shivering in the shadows of her pain. "If law means anything in this town," the cowboy said, his words echoing like scripture, "then it means protecting those who can't protect themselves. You let this man beat her in the open street and you failed her. You failed all of us." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, but the murmurs of agreement in the crowd gave him no escape. Finally he nodded, moving to haul the husband up by the collar. "You'll spend the night in a cell," he muttered. Dragging the sputtering brute away, the townsfolk parted, some nodding at the cowboy with gratitude, others whispering about the audacity of what had just unfolded. The woman stood there trembling, unsure what came next. She had spent years walking on broken glass, afraid of every shadow in her own home. Now, in the space of a few breaths, her world had been shaken in ways she could hardly comprehend. The cowboy turned to her, removing his hat respectfully, his eyes softening from steel to compassion. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you don't deserve that. No one does. You're stronger than you think, and you got choices. Don't let him make you believe otherwise." Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow this time, but of release, of the first taste of freedom she had dared to imagine. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice breaking. The cowboy gave her a small nod. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for standing. The hardest step is believing you're worth saving, and you are." The crowd slowly dispersed, the energy of the moment lingering like a ghost in the air. Some returned to their shops, others to their homes, but none would forget what they'd witnessed that day. The woman walked beside the cowboy for a few steps, her head bowed. "What do I do now?" she asked softly. The cowboy looked down the long, dusty road stretching beyond the town, the horizon painted in shades of gold by the sinking sun. "You start new," he said. "You hold your head high and you walk forward. And if you ever feel like falling, remember you ain't alone. Folks will stand with you, same as I did." The sheriff eventually returned, his hat in hand, guilt written across his face. "Cowboy," he said, "you did what I should have done. You reminded us all what justice means. Sometimes we get too used to turning our eyes away. That ends today." The cowboy simply nodded, then tipped his hat toward the woman before turning to his horse tethered at the post. He mounted up, his silhouette cutting strong against the dying light. The town watched him ride off. A quiet hero who asked for no reward, no recognition, only the satisfaction of knowing he had stood for what was right. The woman stood tall now, her shoulders no longer bowed beneath the weight of fear. For the first time in years, she breathed deeply, freely, as though the chains around her heart had been broken. And in her silence there was strength. The cowboy's words echoed in her mind. "Not while I'm breathing." Those words weren't just his promise. They had become her own. She would not bow again. She would not let the past chain her future. So if you're hearing this story, remember this truth. Courage isn't always about drawing a gun or winning a fight. Sometimes it's about stepping in when others turn away. Sometimes it's about standing for someone who can't stand for themselves. And sometimes it's about being brave enough to believe in your own worth. My friend, if you believe in courage, in justice, in the strength to rise when life tries to push you down, then don't just let this story pass you by. Subscribe to this channel, join this family of believers in resilience and honor, and let's walk this journey together. Because just like that cowboy, we stand for one another, and as long as we breathe, we don't back down. The dust of that day never really settled in the hearts of those who witnessed it. For though the drunken husband had been dragged off by the sheriff and locked into a cell, the memory of the cowboy standing tall in the middle of the street, his voice carrying the words, "Not while I'm breathing," lingered like scripture carved into stone. The woman, whose name was Mary, carried that moment in her chest like a fragile ember struggling to become flame, for she had lived so long in the cold shadow of fear that she had forgotten what warmth felt like. That night, in the small room above the general store where she stayed after the sheriff refused to send her back to her husband's home, Mary sat at the window, staring at the moonlight spilling across the dusty road, her hands trembling as she remembered every strike, every insult, every night she had hidden bruises beneath fabric and tears behind a brittle smile. But now, for the first time in years, she felt something new, hope, and it terrified her just as much as it inspired her. She thought of the cowboy, his broad shoulders cutting the sunset in half, his voice steady yet kind, his presence like a wall against the storms of her life, and she wondered why a man who owed her nothing would risk everything for her dignity. In another part of town, the cowboy sat by the fire at the livery stable where he had laid down his bedroll, polishing the leather of his boots, his hat tipped low, lost in thought. He had faced gunslingers, outlaws, and dangers that most men would never dream of. But standing up against a husband in the middle of town had weighed heavier on him than he expected. For he knew it wasn't just about fists or violence, it was about right and wrong, about showing a broken woman that she was worth standing for. And that kind of fight was the hardest of all. Morning came, painting the horizon with a pink glow, and the town began to stir. Mary walked slowly down the boardwalk, her head held higher than the day before, though her steps still carried caution, for freedom felt foreign and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to carry it yet. People nodded at her with respect, some even offering small words of kindness. And though she wasn't used to being seen as anything other than a burden, she allowed herself to breathe in the gentleness of their recognition. She found herself drawn toward the stable, where the cowboy was tightening the saddle on his horse. For a long moment she just stood, watching him, unsure if she should interrupt, but the sound of her breath must have carried because he turned his head, his eyes finding hers instantly, as if he'd known she was coming. He tipped his hat slightly and gave a small smile. "Mornin', ma'am," he said in that steady tone that made her knees weaken. "You sleep all right?" Mary hesitated, then nodded, though the truth was her sleep had been restless, haunted by memories and interrupted by the strange new feeling of freedom trying to fight its way into her dreams. "I did better than I have in years," she whispered, her voice carrying both gratitude and sorrow. The cowboy studied her for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and resolve. "That's a start," he said simply. Before they could speak further, the sheriff approached, his expression grim. "Cowboy," he said, "we've got a problem. That man, her husband, he's raising hell in my jail. Swearing vengeance. Says he'll tear this town."